managed to find what they saw as flaws in Gary Webb's work. Now his own executive editor at the San Jose Mercury News, in an extraordinary column last Sunday, has distanced himself from Webb's work as well. What's really going on here? We'll try to find out on today's edition of Living Room, Pacifica Radio's daily nationwide call-in program. Good afternoon. I'm Larry Bensky, and we'll be talking to Gary Webb and to longtime investigative reporter Robert Parry as well in this hour today on Living Room, right after we go to Pacifica's Washington Bureau for a look at today's news headlines with Patricia Guadalupe.
Thanks, Larry. Attorney General Janet Reno ordered prosecutors today to seek the death penalty for Unabomber suspect Theodore Kaczynski. Despite requests from his family that he be spared, they argued that other families might be reluctant to turn in relatives if a death penalty sentence is imposed. Prosecutors contend Kaczynski is responsible for 18 years of bombings that took 3 people's lives and injured 23 others in a campaign against technology. Kaczynski's trial is set to start next November in Sacramento, California. The Senate is set to vote today later on a Democratic alternative to a bill that would allow some late-term abortions. The proposal from the senators would allow such abortions to save the mother from serious health consequences. The president had vetoed bills in the past that did not contain that provision. Also in the Senate, Budget Committee Chairman Pete Domenici's plan to cut more than $212 billion in funds in order to balance the budget by the year 2002 could also come up for a vote later tonight. Most of the cuts are to social programs and higher education and leaves the military virtually intact. Zairean President Mobutu Sese Seko returned to Kinshasa and faces a rebel ultimatum to leave within 2 days. South African President Nelson Mandela says he will keep going with peace talks and met with rebel leader Laurent Kabila earlier today. Also in the news, a House committee that is investigating allegations of fraud in the congressional race that Republican Bob Dornan lost last year has now subpoenaed the Immigration and Naturalization Service for their records into the number of residents of that district that became citizens in time to vote in that race. Dornan has maintained that undocumented immigrants voted illegally and gave the edge to now Congresswoman Loretta Sanchez. And a bill to require unions to disclose what they specifically use their membership dues for its making the rounds on Capitol Hill. Conservatives allege unions use dues for partisan political activities and go against the majority of their membership by doing that. And that's what's coming off of the Pacifica Network News. Larry.
Thanks, Patricia Guadalupe. Gary Webb's Dark Alliance series in the San Jose Mercury News last August stated that a Northern California drug ring sold tons of cocaine in inner-city Los Angeles and funneled millions of dollars in drug profits to the anti-government Contra rebels seeking to overthrow Nicaragua's Sandinistas. Webb also wrote that the Contras' financiers met with CIA agents before and during the time they were selling the drugs. The series caused an uproar, especially in Los Angeles, where angry citizens demanded accountability from the CIA, while 3 of the country's leading newspapers launched their own belated investigations, ultimately concluding that things hadn't happened quite the way Gary Webb said they had. Congressional and government investigations were started and still continue, but last Sunday, a startling note to readers from the Mercury News executive editor appeared in the paper, saying that the Mercury News should have done better in what he called gray areas, including whether and how much money was sent by drug dealers to the Contras, whether the drug ring involved was really significant in the rise of crack in Los Angeles, and whether the CIA's knowledge of these things should have been implied in the series. We're going to discuss that series today and its aftermath and the present status of Gary Webb's investigations and parallel investigations with 3 people. We'll have Gary Webb with us momentarily. Right now we're joined from Washington, from our WPFW studios, by Robert Parry, longtime investigative reporter. Robert Parry broke some of the original Iran-Contra stories in the mid-1980s when he was working with the Associated Press. Later he worked for Newsweek and PBS Frontline series. He now heads his own consortium for independent journalism in Virginia. Welcome once again to Pacifica Radio, Bob Parry.
Thank you.
Bob, I would think it would be instructive here if briefly, and I know you could do this probably for the whole hour, you could tell our listeners what the CIA typically does when they're faced with the kind of confrontational journalism that you've done in the past and what Gary Webb has done here.
Well, they usually deny it.
Well, that's for sure. But then what?
Well, they also have a good deal of influence in the Washington establishment. There is, at a certain level of journalism and politics and in the national security arena, overlap where editors, senior editors, might be on the Council for Foreign Relations and meet with people who work closely with the CIA or are part of the CIA. So there are social connections and political connections that exist throughout the city of Washington, D.C., which gives the CIA a good deal more influence than I think many citizens may understand. I think most citizens would look at this and think of the CIA as a very separate, secret entity lodged off at Langley, Virginia, that deals with foreign matters and interferes in foreign countries. But it's also very influential inside the Beltway. And so what you will see often will be key editors, key publications, key news outlets of all kinds, rallying to the side of the CIA when it comes under this kind of criticism.
Now, what happened to you in the mid-1980s when you and I first met, actually, around Iran-Contra time, and you were working for the Associated Press, and you and your then partner, Brian Barger, had some of this material on the fact that the Contras were linked to drug dealing and that the CIA either winked about it or knew about it or had something to do with it? What happened to your work in this field?
Well, Brian Barger and I were working in the middle of 1985 together on stories about Oliver North. Our AP wrote the first story in June of '85, describing in a very sketchy way North's activities supporting the Contras in secret. We continued those investigations into the fall, and we really stumbled upon through interviews with Contras, with their supporters, with law enforcement people, the fact that a number of Contra units, really in both Honduras and Costa Rica, although we focused on Costa Rica initially, had become involved with drug trafficking. We went down to Miami and interviewed more people. We obtained some documents that had been developed in Central America especially by the Costa Rican authorities. We went down to Costa Rica. We interviewed law enforcement officials there, both U.S. and Costa Rican. We talked to more Contras, and we talked to U.S. officials back in Washington. And what they confirmed to us over and over again was that the Contras were involved in drug trafficking.
Now, what was the magnitude that we're talking about here? Because one of the complaints about, quibbles with, or big criticisms of Gary Webb's series, and we'll be talking with Gary Webb momentarily, is that some of this sure may have been going on, but not on anything like the type of magnitude that would have been necessary to fund an army, even a very small army such as the one that the Contras were in the early 1980s.
Well, we never quantified the amounts in our stories. We pretty much just described the fact that it was occurring. But I think one can argue that the Contra connection to the cocaine trade was significant. Not just because the Contras themselves were involved in transshipping cocaine or protecting flights or even handling their own drugs into the United States, but the Contras were working closely with the Honduran military. The Honduran military provided protection for the Contras in Honduras, and also was doing this really at the behest of the United States government. The Honduran military was deeply involved in drug trafficking. Some of the largest shipments ever stopped in Miami were coming by sea from Honduras. In Panama, of course, where you had Bill Casey and Oliver North recruiting Manuel Noriega to help the Contras, you also had significant drug trafficking.
So why didn't we read about this on the front page of the New York Times? If Robert Parry could find out about it with Brian Barger and file Associated Press stories, certainly these larger newspapers, the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Los Angeles Times, could have found out about it as well.
Well, the Washington Post and the New York Times took very protective positions on behalf of the Contras and on behalf of the CIA. They had editorially swung into the Contra camp by the mid-1980s. There was a sense that these stories were very risky. There was a reporter for the New York Times who was assigned to this, who said he would only write these kinds of stories if the evidence was in effect perfect. But in these kinds of areas,
we'd be in a hell of a shape if we all waited for our evidence to be perfect as journalists.
Well, pretty much. I mean, and as you know, even in courts of law, where it's not just a matter of a journalist writing a story, it's a matter of people being put away in prison. Routinely, prosecutors use convicted felons, other drug dealers. These are the people who know what happened. But the position that the New York Times and the Washington Post, in effect, took was that such witnesses would not be allowed to be given any credibility in this investigation because they did what they said reflected badly on the U.S. government and its national security operations.
Well, now we have the New York Times coming out editorially yesterday and in a front-page story the day before, gleefully, I can only use that word, I think it's appropriate, saying that the Mercury News has now denounced Gary Webb's stories. New York Times saying there's little hard evidence to support these claims and congratulating the Mercury News for candor in self-criticism. And as far as I'm concerned, this takes the Chutzpah Journalism Award of the decade. The New York Times has never come clean, as they say in their editorial, the Mercury News comes clean. Has the New York Times ever come clean about allowing Claire Sterling, the noted hysterical anti-communist, to purport her plot to kill the Pope on page 1 and making her for one day a New York Times correspondent to peddle that CIA story? Has the New York Times ever come clean about offing their reporter Raymond Bonner for having reported the massacre at El Mozote in El Salvador? Has the New York Times ever come clean about assigning ideologues like Shirley Christian and Stephen Kinzer to cover the Sandinistas in Nicaragua? No, the New York Times has never come clean on that. And yet here they are saying, well, the Mercury News has now come clean, and they can re-enter the fellowship of journalists.
Well, I think, Larry, the point I would make also is that here we had a situation in the 1980s where significant volumes of cocaine were coming into the United States. I should add here very quickly that beyond the Honduran military and the Costa Ricans and the Panamanians who were working with the Contras and dealing in cocaine, you also had the Cuban Americans who went from Miami to Central America to work with the Contras being described by U.S. officials as having been up to their eyeballs in cocaine. And you had members of the Medellin cartel, which is not a small organization in terms of the volume of cocaine, paying large sums, millions of dollars, to the Contras to support them and in the view of the cartel buy some protection from U.S. law enforcement. So you had a major problem that was developing that implicated the U.S. government. The U.S. government was indeed protecting the Contras and their allies for national security reasons. That is, when reporters or federal investigators or, say, congressional investigators looked into this, we were constantly confronted with obstructions brought about by the U.S. government and by in many cases, by places like the New York Times. So you had, it seems to me that if there should be an investigation, an internal critique, there should also be one for why the New York Times and why the Washington Post failed to do their basic journalistic responsibilities to protect the American people and to inform them about information that ironically now both those papers accept as true. If you read this, if you went back to the last fall and read the story, for instance, that Walter Pincus wrote in the Washington Post, while he attacks Gary Webb, he also says, oh, by the way, that all those stories of the 1980s are now well documented.
Well, we now have Gary Webb with us, Robert Parry. We've had a moment of technical difficulty here, and Gary Webb will be with us for the rest of this program. He joins us from public radio station KXPR in Sacramento. Welcome to Pacifica Radio, Gary Webb.
Good afternoon.
Gary, you've been over the media in the past few days, including on numerous local and national Pacifica programs, and I know some of our listeners have heard you already and are familiar with the circumstances. I want to jump right to something that I understand you did yesterday, although I didn't see it myself. A listener called and told me that you'd been on CNN and you were waving around a handful of papers saying, I've got more on this story and they won't let me publish it. Is this true?
That's not true.
Okay. What did she see?
It certainly it wasn't me.
So I have to check these things.
The fact of the matter is that we do have a lot more information that's been sitting in the can since February. we got 4 additional stories that so far have made sort of a snail's progress towards getting into the paper.
Well, you would seem to have the ideal journalist's job. I mean, you spent, 5 months producing Dark Alliance. You wrote a 3-part series. Since then, it's been 7 more months. I don't read the Mercury News every day, but I read it enough to know that I haven't seen your byline covering stories from Sacramento, so I assume...
I've been working on this full time.
Right, you're working on this full time.
Right.
They're paying you full time, and you don't ever have to produce anything.
Well, that's not quite as a good job as all that. You get into the newspaper business to write stories, and what I've been doing the last couple of months is writing memos.
Now, what's in those stories, Gary Webb? What, if you could publish those stories in San Jose Mercury News tomorrow or somewhere else, would you be doing to advance the story?
Well, what these stories do is, we went back down to Costa Rica. We went back down to Nicaragua twice. We interviewed members of the drug ring, eyewitnesses to this stuff. And what we came up with was evidence that, members of this drug ring had very solid connections to U.S. government officials. We have a paper trail now that goes into the National Security Council. We have evidence.
This is at what period of time?
This is during the 1980s.
What part of the 1980s?
1986.
So you're talking about Oliver North time?
Absolutely. We have, some of the stuff that we've gotten from the National Archives recently strongly suggests that not only was the CIA aware of it, they were aware of very specific details of this drug trafficking, particularly at Ilopango Air Base in El Salvador.
Which was the air base that was being used by the
North
CIA,
Network.
And then the North Network, and then
right.
again by the CIA after the funding was restored in order to supply the Contras on the so-called Northern Front in Honduras. Gary Webb, when you say the CIA knew, I think this is a point where a lot of people start to quibble with you, and they certainly have done more than quibble. They've criticized you in print, saying, what does he mean by the CIA? Does he mean some low-level drug guy who once met a CIA officer, then immediately becomes a CIA person? How far can you trace this into the CIA hierarchy?
Well, the initial series talked about a meeting that occurred in Honduras with Colonel Enrique Bermudez, who was the military commander of the Contra Army known as the FDN. The funny thing about hearing all this revisionist history is that two of the drug dealers that were at this meeting, Norwin Meneses and Danilo Blandón, both of whom were very active Contra sympathizers and Contra supporters, both of them acknowledged that Bermudez told them to go to the United States and raise money for the Contras. Bermudez was a 10-year-long CIA agent. And there's just no question about that. So they were getting their fundraising orders directly from a CIA agent.
Okay, let me just say a CIA agent. The CIA officers are people who work for the CIA. CIA agents are people who are paid by the CIA to do something.
Right.
Bermudez, as far as we know, was on the pad, as they say, for around $3,000 a month, which is not a lot in CIA terms. Adolfo Calero, for example, of the Contras, was getting 4 times that amount of money. I wonder in this series, and I've never had a chance to actually talk with you about this before, and because I must have sinned mightily in a previous life, I had to be off on another story all last year called Electoral Politics, so I didn't have a chance to follow this stuff as closely as I had previously. But what I wondered about in this series, and I'd like to ask Robert Parry about this too, is that the period of time that we're talking about here, the early 1980s, the Contras at that point were a few hundred maybe, people who had been in Somoza's National Guard, including Enrique Bermudez, their leader, who had made it across the border into Honduras. They had not yet started recruiting big time. They did not get their official authorization to get CIA money until Ronald Reagan authorized that in late 1981 or early 1982, I believe it was. So to me, the magnitude of the money that you're talking about, funding a ragtag collection of people, some of whom were family members, not even fighters, doesn't quite fit. In other words, if you're saying millions of dollars were sent from a cocaine operation down to the northern border of Honduras, it seems like a very big rat was being forced into a very small python, if you will.
Well, you have to look at this in the terms of the historical context. I mean, you're right. December of '81, Reagan authorized the CIA to spend $19.9 million on the Contras. Most of that money was given to the Argentines who were training the Contras at that time. This drug ring supplied money from that point, and we found evidence of it all the way through 1986. So you can spread several $1 million out over a number of years. It's really not all that much.
All right, Robert Parry,
but it still is millions.
We got to take a quick break here. When we come back, we're going to have Congresswoman Maxine Waters to have her comments about what's going on this. But Robert Parry, quickly, does this compute from what you know, and you've studied this and you know much more about it than I do, in the early 1980s, would the ragtag band of people across the border in Honduras have been able to absorb multi-millions of dollars from anywhere, drug dealers, etc.? Or what we're talking about here is a level of corruption, perhaps, where the money was going to people who said they were Contras, but was really going into bank accounts in Miami?
Well, there was some of that, but there's no question. War is a very expensive business, even a small war.
They hadn't started the war yet till 1981. Well, they didn't do their first action till early 1982.
That's not true. There were actions as early as 1980 and certainly by 81. That was done by the so-called 15th of September Legion, which was the predecessor to the Contras. It was described in a DIA report as a terrorist organization for its attacks on civilian targets. But
who was funding them?
It wasn't entirely clear. The Argentines, as Gary says, fresh from the dirty war of Argentina in the mid-'70s, were spreading their anti-communist approach, which involved torture, murder of a wide variety of kinds of attacks, into Central America, and they were using the Contras as one of their first groups to train.
They were also funding themselves by bank robberies and kidnappings in Guatemala.
Exactly, and there was also efforts to bomb airplanes, which is what led to the DIA's denunciation of the 15th of September Legion as a terrorist organization. Yes, that became the FDN.
That became the FDN, and that's the point that I wanted to pick up the story. But right now, we do have to take a brief break. When we come back, we're going to get an update from Congresswoman Maxine Waters about what's going on in official Washington to investigate all of this and what effect the note in the San Jose Mercury News last Sunday may have had. So join us. We'll be back in 60 seconds. This is Living Room, Pacifica Radio's daily nationwide call-in program. Today we're discussing the Iran-Contra, CIA, crack, whole constellation of events. We have Gary Webb, the author of the Dark Alliance series in the San Jose Mercury News, Robert Parry, investigative journalist who was working on this as early as the mid-1980s, and we're now joined for a brief period of time from Washington by Maxine Waters, Congresswoman from Los Angeles. Welcome once again to Pacifica Radio, Congresswoman Waters.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you today.
And it's great that you were able to join us. I know you're pressed for time, so we'll go right away to you and ask you, if you could, to update our listeners on where do all these investigations stand after Gary Webb's series came out last August. The CIA said its Inspector General was going to do an internal investigation. The Justice Department said its Inspector General was going to do its investigation. The Senate Intelligence Committee, then under Senator Specter, said it was going to do its investigation. And the House Intelligence Committee said it was going to do an investigation. There was one electric moment when the Senate was having a hearing, and somebody in the audience, rightfully I thought, stood up and said, "This is a big whitewash." And Senator Specter called you up to the podiums. First time you were inducted immediately into the United States Senate. You became Senator Waters for a moment. And you were part of that, and you have pledged over and over again to follow this through to wherever it leads. Where's it leading?
Well, let me just say that I'm very, very pleased that with the latest discussion about the journalistic styles and the discussion basically by the San Jose Mercury that they thought that they could have done it better in some ways. The Inspector General of the Justice Department made it clear to everybody that these investigations are underway and they will continue. all of the investigations are underway. They are cooperating with each other. They had some people down in Nicaragua this past weekend following up on some information I had given them as a result of my visit to speak with Mr. Enrique Ramirez, who's in jail there, who's got information to share. So the investigations are moving forward. Nothing has changed. Nothing has stopped those investigations that are going on. They're culling through thousands of documents and interviewing hundreds of witnesses. This may result in hearings as early as August, but I think we should be very patient and let them do the work. This work will not be done overnight. This is a long period of time since the drug ring existed in South Central Los Angeles that we're investigating, and I do know that they've got to frame it by culling through these documents and taking a look at who to talk to and who to follow up on.
Okay, when you say there may be hearings as early as August, is that in the House committee, the Senate committee, a joint hearing?
That's in the House committee. That's the latest information that I have from the Inspector General of the Justice Department and the House Intelligence Committee.
Now, traditionally, the way such hearings are conducted, although the Republicans have been changing this condition substantially over the past few years, there's a majority and a minority staff. Everybody is briefed. Everybody has a chance, whether or not they're in the majority or the minority, to participate in this. Is it your understanding that that will happen? Because my antennae were raised when I found that Porter Goss is now head of the House Intelligence Committee.
Yeah, your antenna should be raised.
He's a lifetime CIA. His career was spent as a CIA officer.
CIA officer, and I was distressed when he ended up being chair of that committee. However, we do the best that we can. Julian Dixon from the Los Angeles area is on the committee, and I do know he was one of the ones that was down in Nicaragua this past weekend with the other investigators. So I do trust him and trust that he will pay close attention and do the work that's necessary to keep it from being a whitewash. And after they come back with their findings, then we'll see where we go from there.
Are you yourself on that committee now?
No. They would never put me on intelligence committee.
Well, let me just ask Robert Parry, if you'd stay with us for a moment, Maxine Waters. What's your level of confidence in a House committee that is going to be chaired by a former CIA officer?
Well, it's not high. The history has not been very pretty, especially when the Republicans have tried to defend the legacy of Reagan and Bush. They have not been very honest. We saw certainly out of Iran-Contra, as you remember, Larry, their report in '87, there was a minority report that the Republicans put out from the House side, which was essentially a total whitewash. It said, the majority report wasn't all that great either, but the minority report by the Republicans simply said there were no crimes broken in the Iran-Contra scandal, which was an argument that was clearly repudiated by the pursuant investigation by Lawrence Walsh. Right. So the history is not good. I do think Michael Bromwich of the Justice Department, the Inspector General there, who was on Walsh's staff, if you remember.
Oh, I remember well. He was one of the people that prosecuted Oliver North.
That's right.
He is one of the more promising of the figures, I think.
FBI lab.
Right, and he's dealt with the problems in the FBI lab. What were you saying, Robert?
Well, I think Mr. Bromwich is a person who has shown a tenacity to follow leads and follow them into difficult places. So I think of all the various investigations, that may be the most promising, but I have no inside knowledge on it.
Let me ask Gary Webb here to share perhaps with Maxine Waters. Traditionally when government investigators go on the ground somewhere like Nicaragua and reporters go on the ground, they tend to cross each other's tracks. Gary Webb, you've been down there a couple of times. You think the House Intelligence Committee and other U.S. government officials are looking in the right places now? Do you come across their tracks?
Actually, they came across our tracks. We have been interviewing for hours and hours and hours this fellow that Maxine was talking about, Enrique Miranda, who was the right-hand man to the Contra supporter who ran the drug ring. He was one of the guys that we tried to interview last year and disappeared from a jail cell the day that we set up the interview. He was captured in Miami in December, and I don't know how else you could put it, sort of kidnapped by the FBI.
Yeah.
He disappeared from a jail cell where? In Nicaragua?
In Nicaragua.
Okay.
He turned up in Miami working for the Drug Enforcement Administration. honestly, I've got the records from the DEA that confirm this, and he was kidnapped by the FBI, thrown on a plane, and put in the jail where his former boss, Norwin Meneses, was staying. And there was a great fear that he was going to be killed down there. We've gone down and interviewed him a number of times. He is a fount of information. He was a former Sandinista intelligence officer. If Julian Dixon's talking to him, he's going to get an earful. There are other people down there who we have talked to, however, who have never been approached by any government investigators, who have direct knowledge of this operation.
And so it's fair to say, isn't it, that if the San Jose Mercury News were to publish the articles that you're writing that you say they're sitting on, people like Maxine Waters and Julian Dixon could get further leads as to who to talk to.
Absolutely.
But you're not working for them.
No, nor, with all due respect, do I want to work for the government.
That's not the way journalism works.
No, I mean, I'm an investigative reporter. I do my own work. And this was the sort of the great irony of this column that appeared Sunday, was that it pretended that we don't know a lot of things that we actually do know.
Well, let me make you the AG offer here, Gary Webb. If the San Jose Mercury News won't print your stories, I'll invite you to come on this program as many sessions as it takes and read them. And I will post them on a website. We have a kind of a dormant website here on Living Room, and I'll put it into action. And Maxine Waters and anybody else can see them, and I'm sure I can get them in print, too, for people who want to see them. And I say it's the Agee offer because in the mid-1970s, when Philip Agee's book was banned in the United States, we read it live on Pacifica Radio to avoid the ban, and it was subsequently published.
You need to know that I did talk with Mr. Sipos from the San Jose Mercury News and really issued a strong challenge to him to publish these articles, and he agreed that I would call him back next week to see what his decision is. He said he was looking at the information and that, of course, he reserved the right to do it or not do it, but I asked him, did he still feel the same sense of responsibility that he felt when Gary published the first set of articles under the Dark Alliance series? And he said he did, and I said then, of course, that would be exhibited by publishing the rest of these articles. So I'm very hopeful, and I will call him back.
Well, when you do, we'll be in touch with you as well. I know we've got to let you go. Maxine Waters, thank you for joining us briefly.
Well, thank you so much, and I wish I could stay longer, but I really must get off the phone now.
I know you do, and we appreciate the time you're able to spend with us, Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And the telephone she's hanging up can be picked up by you, the Pacifica listeners, now coast to coast. If you have any questions or comments about what we're talking about this morning with Gary Webb and Robert Parry, the Dark Alliance series, the continuing investigation, do you have any confidence it's ever going to get anywhere? 510-848-4425 is our telephone number here on Living Room, 510-848-4425. And I know it sounds as if Bob Parry and Gary Webb are actually with me, but Robert Parry's in our studio of WPFW in Washington, and Gary Webb is at KXPR in Sacramento, but via the magic of electronics, we've got them all linked up here so they sound live today, and we're going to take some calls and try to find out what your thoughts are on this matter. First, quickly, Robert Parry, you've written about all of this and much more in a new book that you were kind enough to send me, kind of a pamphlet book called Lost History, Contras, Cocaine, and Other Crimes. Where can people get that?
Well, it's available through our toll-free number if people would like to call. It's only $15.95. And that number is 1-800-738-1812 or 1-800-738-1812.
1-800-738-1812. They can call
right, and it's a book that summarizes or brings together a number of stories that I've written that deal with this larger issue. It's called Lost History, Contras, Cocaine, and Other Crimes. And the book looks at the history of the 80s and how we got to where we are, not just in the sense of the crimes that were committed by various national security figures during the era, but why and how the news media got so off track.
It does do all that.
To follow up on these things.
Well, we've certainly tried here at Pacifica, and I know you have as well over the years. Johnny in L.A., welcome to Living Room. Johnny, you with us? Johnny in L.A. has momentarily left his telephone, so we'll go to another call, unless we are having Chris in D.C.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, gentlemen.
Hi, Chris.
I'm looking at the Washington Post article. I still have it on my table after reading it a couple of days ago. And the editor there at the Mercury News says that we also did not include the CIA comments about our findings, and I think we should have. And I just don't believe that reporters and a paper such as the Mercury News wouldn't have contacted the CIA. And I'm wondering if Gary Webb could tell us about that. And then I have another contradiction.
Well, let's just deal with that one first.
Thank
okay,
you.
Chris, go ahead, Gary Webb. Did you try to call the CIA?
Yeah, we called them twice and never got a call back. And
how unusual.
Yeah, and then I took the extra step of filing a Freedom of Information Act request for information regarding these individuals, and we're told that they couldn't release this information because of national security reasons. Subsequent to that, they came out with this amazing statement, which I've never seen ever before in the history of the CIA, in which they specifically disavowed knowledge of these guys. So why they couldn't have said that in their Freedom of Information Act response the first time is sort of an open question.
And there's also, Sepos wrote, I feel we did not have proof that top CIA officials knew of the relationship, talking about the relationship between Contra leaders and crack dealers in Los Angeles. How on earth did he ever expect you or anybody else to get proof that top CIA officials knew of anything when the independent counsel wasn't able to do that in the case of Iran-Contra, when none of the congressional committees were able to do that, when people who've sued the CIA for years aren't able to find that out? Is he really holding you to that standard of proof?
Well, if he is now, these stories are never going to appear in the paper. The problem is that the original stories never said there was top-level CIA knowledge, and what was surprising about that is he wrote a letter to the Washington Post back in October after they did their debunking piece, which said specifically the stories never said there was top-level CIA knowledge, and he criticized the Washington Post for claiming that we'd had. So it's kind of hard to...
There's a problem there too, though, because there was top-level knowledge of the CIA.
That's the other problem.
If you go,
how do you know that?
If you go to it's in the books. It's in the depositions. It's Alan Fires, who was the chief of the Central American Task Force, which put him directly in charge of the Contra operations. Mr. Fires was an extremely high-level CIA man, and he testified that as far as the Southern Front in Costa Rica, he said that it wasn't just a few Contras involved with cocaine trafficking, it was lots of them. And if you look at in our original AP story, which ran in December of 1985, we cited a Central Intelligence Agency report on narcotics trafficking written by a man named Charles Allen, another senior official, in which he described the role of cocaine money in buying helicopters for the RDA unit, the RDA Army in Costa Rica, which was one of the major Contra forces at the time. So the CIA did know about these allegations. And
what we have to ask Mr. Sepos is, what does he mean by the word proof? I mean, if it isn't enough to have
signed confessions, I guess.
we cited the CIA in that original AP story as one of our sources for knowing that the Contras were involved in drugs.
And it's all over the Iran-Contra hearings, of course, in the trial of Oliver North and North's notebooks and other places, and Noriega, et cetera. So, yeah, we do know that.
Then you get into the issue of if that's the level of proof, you need top-level CIA knowledge of this. That excuses them for 99% of what goes on in the field every day.
And William Casey's dead, so we're never going to hear from him. Al in L.A., join us on Living Room.
Yes, good afternoon. It's an honor to be on the air with Gary Webb. Hey, I have some quick points I'd like to touch on. Former DEA agent Celerino Castillo alleges that he personally told George Bush about the CIA shenanigans happening at the Ilopango airport. I wonder if you could comment on that. Also, we haven't heard anything about Dick Blum. I think Dick Blum ought to be elected like dictator for life for what he did. And I'm wondering, on Sepos, I checked out the San Jose Mercury website yesterday to try to reread Dark Alliance, and in its place was this Sepos cover-up kind of
Dark Alliance is still on there. Sepos just is the lead piece.
I couldn't find it. All right, I'm going to look again as soon as I get off the phone.
Look
I only
again.
got one phone line. But do you think Sepos was threatened, or do you think they paid him to do this? And
well, that's a lot of questions.
So I want to answer it, listen off the air.
All right, well, let's just deal with the third one, because I think the first two are statements rather than questions. Go ahead, Gary Webb.
Which question am I answering
Sepos, why is he doing this?
That's a good question. I really can't fathom the reason for this. I mean, if you read his column, he says it's because he's concerned that we didn't meet standards, and if you actually read what these alleged shortcomings were, you could apply them to any story in the newspaper any day of the week. So I'm really puzzled by this whole, burst of mea culpas over a story which he acknowledges is true.
We're going to be back with Robert Parry from Washington, D.C., and Gary Webb from Sacramento, and me, Larry Bensky, from Berkeley, California, and your phone calls at 510-848-4425 after we take a 60-second break. And this is Living Room, and we're going to go to Andrew in L.A. right after I assure that caller and anybody else who's calling that as recently as last night, and I think this is true, Gary, tell me if you know it's not true, the original series is still up there. If you click on History, I think they now have it. It leads off with Cepos, but...
and I think that's totally due to some of the folks at Merck Center, because my information is they wanted to shut the website down completely.
Well, the address for it, if any of our listeners want to see it, is www.sjmercury.com/drugs/ www.sjmercury.com/drugs/. I visit it every so often because they've been very good so far at posting all the critiques of your story as well as responses. There's a forum where people write in and attack you and defend you. It's been quite good, and I'd be really distressed if they shut it down, and that'll be a whole other program we're going to do if they do that. I assure you. Andrew in Los Angeles, join us on Living Room.
This question is for Gary Webb. I was wondering if any of your new investigations, have you come across any information that links the SNL scandals of the 80s to the Contras and the cocaine and all that?
No, we haven't, but that's a whole nother story. You should talk to Pete Bruton from the Houston Post about that. And it's funny because I was talking to Mr. Bruton about this whole furor the other day, and he said the same thing happened to him. I think it was '91 when the Houston Post did a long series about CIA involvement with SNL failures. And he said, I was an award-winning journalist for 30 years, and the first time I ever wrote those three little letters, CIA, suddenly I was the worst SOB on the block. And it's interesting the way that happens, but I haven't found any evidence to suggest that there's a connection between this drug ring and those SNL failures.
Well, Robert Parry, it certainly happened to you as well. You were an award-winning journalist, and you took your act to Newsweek, and they started they weren't interested in your stories anymore. I remember interviewing back in 1989. I've never seen anybody so unhappy in my life during the trial of Oliver North.
Really?
You said to me, Larry, I just can't talk about my job here. I can talk about the substance of the North case. And shortly after that, you didn't have a job there because Newsweek had decided that the trial of Oliver North and all the things you knew about the CIA and cocaine and Iran-Contra, that wasn't worth your writing about in their magazine.
Actually told me that the Oliver North trial, which occurred, of course, in 1989, was not a news story. if you remember, Larry.
I do remember that. Very clearly, you told me that. I was floored.
Basically, Newsweek was so determined to shut down these investigations as best they could in terms of a journalistic side that they told me I could not cover the North trial. What I then did was arrange to get transcripts of the daily proceedings sent to me at night. There were daily transcripts which I arranged, and a guy on a motorcycle would show up at my house in Arlington, and I'd read the transcripts till 2 in the morning. And out of that, I did write a number of stories. We actually broke some stories, but they hated it.
Isn't that pathetic?
Yeah, it wasn't the brightest moment in journalism.
We'll go to Ray in San Francisco now. Welcome to Living Room, Ray.
Thank you. one would hesitate to ask this question as if it seems that it might already been asked, but you might. There are two questions here, and the first one is whether you'd care to speculate on the kinds of pressure that would be brought to bear on an editor at a newspaper like.
Can you speak up a little, Ray? It's kind of faint.
I said one would like it if you could speculate, if you'd care to, on the kinds of pressure that are brought to bear on editors at newspapers like the San Jose paper, where Mr. Cepos seems to be distancing himself from this. And the other question is, what connection does this have with the prosecution of Celerino Castillo?
Thanks for calling, Ray. What about the pressure?
I hate to speculate about what goes on in those glass offices because that's like trying to divine the future from chicken intestines. I think. I don't know. I mean,
is that really the part of the chicken we're talking about here, or the end product of the digestive system?
Well, I think in general terms, when you are out there alone, as the Mercury News was, there's a tremendous pressure to conform, and I think that a lot of that was to bear. I also think that in Mr. Cepos' defense, this is being portrayed as a retraction, as a correction. And that's just not true. I mean, he said very clearly that the core of the series, that there were Contras selling cocaine in South Central Los Angeles, sending money down to Central America, and that they were selling it to the Crips and the Bloods, who were spreading it across the country. That's unchallenged.
But it's ominous that he headed it epilogue. An epilogue is something that comes at the end. And when I saw that, I said to myself, they're not going to run any more stuff. This is the epilogue.
I have to be honest with you. That's what I thought, too.
What comes after an epilogue?
An epitaph.
Maybe a sequel.
Let's go to Robert in Albany. I don't mean to gloss over his question about Celerino Castillo, but that requires a whole other predicate for us to talk about, and maybe we'll do that someday on this program. But right now we want to stay with this series if we can. Robert in Albany, welcome to Living Room.
Thank you. Two questions. The first was, can you tell me whatever happened to that fellow Eugene Hassenfuss? And second is, can you have any idea? I mean, there's been a lot of press about this over the years, the last 5 or 10 years maybe, about the implications of all this, but yet there doesn't seem to be all that much public interest, and I wondered if maybe you could comment on that.
Well, it's chicken and egg, isn't it, Robert Parry? Public interest. You can't have public interest if the news media aren't dealing with it. When was the last time anybody on CBS or NBC or any of the networks dealt with any of this stuff on it?
But they shut that guy down out of a plane, I mean.
Oh, Hassenfuss himself. Oh, yeah, he recovered. He's the cargo kicker who was the survivor of the supply plane that was shot down over southern Nicaragua.
It was a very important moment in our history, what happened that day, because I'd been writing about the North matter for well over a year, and at AP, and Brian Barger and I had gone through pretty much what Gary Webb is going through now. Brian had been put on the overnight desk at AP, and then was pushed out of the company. If you remember, in the summer of '86, Oliver North told the House Intelligence Committee that none of this had happened, and they believed him. And I received
a lot of the media.
And I received a call from one of Hamilton's people saying we had a choice between believing you and your 24 sources, which were the basis of our story, or these honorable men. And it wasn't a close call. And so that's where we stood. We had screwed up in AP's view. And then on October 5th, 1986, one of North's last planes, remember, but at this point Congress had caved in and was giving $100 million to the Contras. The money hadn't gone into the pipeline yet, so there were still these planes going. And some kid, a Sandinista draftee, a teenager, who had never fired a SAM missile before in his life, took aim at this plane, which he saw lumbering over the skies of Nicaragua, and fired it. And he was amazed, he said later, that the missile went right at the plane. And it hit the plane, and Hassenfuss, who I interviewed in Nicaragua after this, said he just happened to be near the door, and it was open because he was preparing to kick out guns, and he had a parachute, the only guy with a parachute on the plane.
The caller's question was whatever happened to him.
He went back to Wisconsin. Last I heard of him, he was back in Wisconsin, living a fairly normal and nondescript life.
Let's take another call here. Good afternoon. You're on Living Room. Hello.
My name's Edward. I've got a question. It's about the kind of cultural shift that I've seen in journalism, or that we've seen in journalism, from, say, the Pentagon Papers, in the publication of them, to the arrival of the Iran-Contra scandal. I'm curious to I'm curious about any thoughts that Gary might have, or any other people there might have, on how that came about. That there's no will in any of the journalists or any of the journalistic institutions in this country.
Oh, wait a minute! Don't confuse those two right there, please. Don't confuse the journalists and the journalistic institutions, because I think we have a classic case.
There are exceptions, certainly, but I mean, if you look at it, let's take an example like the newsroom of the Washington Post. I mean, how many of those journalists that are still there have the guts to really pursue any of these issues? I don't know any of them.
Well, the answer is very few. In this little book that Larry mentioned, I did Lost History. It opens up with a chapter about what's called perception management, and there actually was a very determined effort by the Reagan administration in the early '80s to get the press back in line, and it was under the control of William Casey, who was director of Central Intelligence. He sent over to the National Security Council his top propaganda expert, a man named Walter Raymond Jr. And Walter Raymond Jr. put together a program based largely at the State Department called Public Diplomacy. And the goal of that was to browbeat journalists and their editors into printing what the Reagan administration wanted to see printed about Central America. They called it internally perception management.
They also managed to intimidate National Public Radio in 1984. You also remind us in your book, out of doing much coverage about Central America. The telephone number here is 510-848-4425, 510-848-4425. I interrupted you, Bob Parry. I know you want to finish that thought.
Well, no, it's a good point to mention NPR, because Paul Allen, who was the foreign editor there, was forced out of his job, in part because the NPR had run a program about a Contra massacre of some farm workers in Nicaragua. And so Otto Reich, who was head of this public diplomacy office at State underneath the NSC, which was underneath the CIA, goes to NPR and browbeats them over how they're not running enough pro-Contra material, they're running too much pro-Sandinista material or whatever. And it effectively helped cost this guy his job. And that happened over and over and over again in Washington. There was effectively a purge of journalists who tried to tell the truth.
Gary Webb?
Let me give you a more recent example, and I think this is one of the historic nadirs of American journalism, was what ABC did with the story that Walt Bogdanich, who was a very able investigative reporter, did on nicotine spiking. That was only a couple of years ago, and they ran, full-page newspaper apologies throughout the nation, apologizing for what was essentially a true story.
Well, this would not seem to bode very well for us to ever see in the San Jose Mercury News the next 4 pieces that you've prepared, and I'll make you the offer again. I wasn't making it facetiously. You can come and read them here on this program, but I would imagine you would rather see them in print. Do you have any plans, if the San Jose Mercury News continues to take the kind of attitude that they do right now, to publish these elsewhere, to make them into a book? What's Gary Webb going to do?
Well, I hope to be able to do a book about this whole deal one day. What I want to do is publish it in the Mercury News. I think the intent, at least as was explained to me back in October, and continuing to do this, is we were going to go out and get this information and ram it up the Washington Post butt, which I think is a noble cause for any story. Yeah. But we'll see what happens. I mean, they haven't said no. But they haven't said yes.
They belong to a large chain, and a large chain, of course, has many problems in many areas, not least of which that they're considered to be outrageous labor exploiters in Detroit, Knight Ridder. But that's a whole other story. Knight Ridder Papers did not reprint, as far as I know, your Dark Alliance story. It didn't appear in
Some of them did.
Did it appear in the Miami Herald?
I don't believe so. I don't believe it appeared in the Inquirer.
Philadelphia Inquirer.
It appeared in the Long Beach Press Telegram. And it appeared, went out over the Night Wire, and a lot of other newspapers picked it up from there. I'm not sure how many Knight Ridder newspapers actually did it.
Michael in San Francisco, welcome to Living Room.
Yeah, hi. I just tuned in a little while ago. You might have touched on this earlier, but this whole drug running situation, I think, has to be put as part of a broader picture, which is American foreign policy, and it, in my opinion, is a very imperial foreign policy, especially out in the third world. And I don't have too much time because I'm at work, but I'd like you to maybe talk about that for a few minutes.
Well, we have only a few minutes left, and I think your point is made, and I don't think there's anybody here who would totally disagree with it, and I want to get as many calls in as we can, so we're going to go to Barbara in Camarillo. Thanks for calling us on Living Room, Barbara.
Hi, Larry. How are you doing?
Good.
I want to say hi to Gary. Through all this conversation, we need to remember the communities that have been involved in this and the devastation that bringing drugs in has brought to the different areas in the country. And I do believe that the news, all of the news and information that Gary has should be put on the board for everybody to see so that the communities can do what they have to do and take action.
Well, he's got that offer to post it on Living Room's website and broadcast it on Pacifica anytime he wants.
Well, and I also think it's important to remember, I mean, there were human beings that were affected by this drug ring, and I think if you went down to South Central and asked people if they, if it made a difference to them whether or not top CIA officials knew about it or whether these were just the actions of agents or assets, I don't think the answer is going to be, yeah, it makes a big difference. And that seems to be the point that a lot of people miss, is that this drug organization dumped thousands and thousands and thousands of kilos into a community. It was sort of like a neutron bomb almost. And this idea of quibbling over exactly how many tons and exactly how many years they did it is just like beside the point as far as I'm concerned.
Gary Webb, thank you very much for joining us today on Living Room from Sacramento. Gary Webb, the author of the first 3 and hopefully not the last 3 articles in this series, Dark Alliance. We'll have you back on this program, I'm sure, at some future time. And Robert Parry, thank you very much for joining us from Washington, D.C., veteran investigative reporter whose wisdom has guided many of us who followed his tracks in this whole sordid history ever since the mid-1980s. Once again, he has a new small pamphlet-type book called Lost History, and if you're interested in finding out how to obtain it, the 800 number is 1-800-738-1812. Thanks, Bob Parry.
Thank you.
And this is Pacifica's Living Room. We'll return to this topic, of course, in the future. How can we not? And we thank you all very much for your participation today. You've been listening to Living Room, Pacifica Radio's daily nationwide call-in program. For a copy of this or any other Living Room program, please call the Pacifica Program Service at 1-800-735-0230. That's 1-800-735-0230. We welcome your comments and suggestions. You can write to us online at livingroom@pacifica.org. That's one word, livingroom@pacifica.org. Or by mail, you can write to us at Pacifica Radio, 1929 Martin Luther King Jr. Way, Berkeley, California, 94704. Living Room's producer is Cheryl Flowers. Our assistant producer today is Eve Buckner. Our engineers are Jim Bennett and Abby Rose. Special thanks to Bob Daughtry at Pacifica Station WPFW in Washington, as well as Mark Jones at public radio station KXPR in Sacramento for their help today. Be sure to join us tomorrow for something completely different. Same time, same station, here on Living Room with me, Larry Bensky.